Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all very well and you had a good evening and a good night's sleep. It's my pleasure to welcome you all, a warm welcome to you all, for the plenary session on the last day of the APAN Forum, and this is about understanding loss and damage in the Asia-Pacific region. In the likely scenario of warmer climate in the future, the urgency to proactively prevent losses and damages from anthropogenic climate change, especially for the world's most vulnerable communities, has intensified. Small island developing states and mountainous countries in the region are particularly at risk, experiencing severe climate-induced losses and damages. Acknowledging the urgent need to address the climate crisis, loss and damage has become a central pillar in these efforts. The 27th COP in Sharm-El-Sheikh agreed to create a new funding mechanism for loss and damage. Despite progress on policy, there has been limited progress in addressing loss and damage at the national level. Furthermore, research, finance, and technical support that inform global negotiations on loss and damage are limited, resulting in a lack of evidence to implement solutions and a lack of clarity on how vulnerable countries can formulate policy responses at the national level. This session aims to engage countries in identifying and synthesizing information and insights on their experience in addressing major impacts of climate change, and in particular, losses and damages resulting from hydro-meteorological hazards and extremes. The goal is to identify existing gaps in responding to and addressing these losses and damages and specific needs for technical assistance. We have an exciting lineup. We have opening remarks by the Director of International Climate Change Adaptation Planning at the Climate Change Adaptation Office of the Global Environment Bureau, Ministry of Environment, Japan, followed by 4 panelists, and then enough time for an interactive dialogue with the speakers, facilitated by some guiding questions and questions from the audience. So, without further ado, let me invite Ms. Ayuka Kobayakawa to the stage to give some opening remarks. Ms. Ayuka Kobayakawa works for the Ministry of Environment, Japan, where she has worked in various subjects, including policy and practice in water management, contaminated waste and soil management, and disaster waste management, among others. Currently, as Director for International Climate Change Adaptation Planning, she is responsible for overseeing policies and practices on adaptation and loss and damage. One of the projects that she is focusing on is promoting early warning systems through public-private partnerships in the Asia-Pacific region. Welcome, Ms. Ayuko. Come to the stage, please.
Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm Ayuko Kobayakawa from Ministry of the Environment, Government of Japan. I'm very pleased that the 8th APAN Forum is held as a major regional event that, that attracts many experts. Thank you. And stakeholders. I feel very honored to be invited to speak at this plenary session to discuss loss and damage. First, I would like to thank the Korean government officials for inviting and hosting the APAN Forum. I would like to also thank UNEP and APAN's partner organization for hosting the forum, and the APAN Secretariat for their effort in organizing the forum. So, Japan has supported APAN and the Global Adaptation Network an umbrella network that bring together APAN and other regional networks since its inception. I feel that APAN's activities are becoming increasingly important since the need for adaptation and loss and damage measures to climate change is increasing. In fact, in recent years, extreme weather events have been occurring frequently around the world, and the effects of climate change have not only already become apparent, but they have also become a threat to our society, what we call the climate crisis. So many countries are experiencing the loss and damage associated with the negative effect of climate crisis. To address this climate crisis, COP27 agreed to create a new financial mechanism for loss and damage. Japan believes that it is very important for the international community to work together in order to enhance prompt assistance for loss and damage. The government of Japan has been providing a wide range of support for loss and damage, including human resource development, early warning system development, today I will just discuss, and disaster risk management. We announced at COP27 last year the Japanese government support package for loss and damage, and the government intends to provide comprehensive support for loss and damage in cooperation with the international community. So today, I would like to introduce the initiative to promote the development of early warning system through public-private partnership, which is included in the support package. One of the solutions to address adverse effects of climate change is early warning systems. As you know, the United Nations announced that everyone should be protected by EWS. In response to the declaration, Japan has launched the EWS Public-Private Partnership initiative. So, under the EWS initiative, our goal is to introduce EWS in more than half of the ASEAN members states by 2025. We are already developed a consulting meeting domestically, which invite interested stakeholders to discuss any gap, barriers, and solutions to overcome such difficulties to introduce EWS. With my understanding, most important thing is to align with local needs. In order to understand the needs, we shall promote dialogue and communication with partner countries. So this loss and damage plenary session is a valuable opportunity to share insight and experience and loss and damage, and discuss, identify support needs, and discuss gap in addressing loss and damage. I hope that lively discussion will deepen our understanding of loss and damage, measures and advance our effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayuko, for those opening words, which sets the scene for the session. So we have 4 speakers in the next session. I'm going to invite the first 2 speakers. Professor Salim Hook, Director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development. Please make your way to the stage. And Mr. Arona Ngari, Director of the Cook Islands Meteorological Service. Welcome to the stage. So let me introduce Professor Salim Hook, who will need no introduction, I'm sure, for many. He is the Director of ICAD and Professor at the Independent University Bangladesh, as well as a Senior Associate at the International Institute on Environment and Development. He is in the Advisory Committee of COP28 President at the United Arab Emirates, and he is the Chair of the Expert Advisory Group for the Climate Vulnerable Group, as well as the Senior Advisor on Locally Led Adaptation with the Global Centre on Adaptation. He is an expert in adaptation to climate change in the most vulnerable developing country and has been a lead author on the 3rd, 4th and 5th assessment reports of the IPCC. He also advises the LDC group in the UNFCCC. Welcome, Professor. Arona has been the director of the Cook Islands Meteorological Service for the last 33 years and has taken part in the work of the WMO to enhance the capability of the Cook Island Meteorological Service to minimise the impact of the loss of life and property. Having obtained an MBA with the University of the South Pacific, he has taken on the role of President of the Regional Association of WMO for 2 terms, and has been proactive in the work of the Tropical Cyclone Committee for the Southwest Pacific. Arona has also been involved in the work of the IPCC for 3 decades and is currently the focal point for the Cook Islands. Welcome, sir. So let me turn to Professor Salim Hook to give a few words. Over to you, sir. However you prefer.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and good morning to everybody. So, I have been very closely associated with the Asia-Pacific Adaptation Network and the forums over the years. I've been to all the fora, including this one, and it's been a great pleasure to be part of this growing network. I believe the Asia-Pacific Network on Adaptation is by far the most active regional network on adaptation in the world. But I would say that this particular forum at this particular time is not like previous fora. We have just crossed in the last month of July the hottest month the world has ever seen. And as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described it, we have entered the era of what he calls climate boiling. I call it the era of losses and damages from impacts of climate change. They have started, they are happening. If you watch the news every evening, you will see something happening somewhere. A flood, a wildfire, a heat wave. In fact, here in Korea, just a few weeks ago, they had a flooding incident that took a number of lives. This is now the new normal. So in this context, I feel we have to rethink what we define and understand adaptation to climate change to be. And in my view, we should redefine it as minimizing the inevitable losses and damages from climate change. Adaptation does not solve the climate change problem. It just minimizes the losses and damages. There will always be losses and damages, even with the best adaptation. But if you do good adaptation, you minimize those loss and damage, and then you have to deal with them. Which means that in our work on adaptation from now on, I believe we need to add loss and damage to adaptation in a nexus approach. The nexus being we adapt to minimize potential impacts of climate change, but when they happen, we then have to move immediately into addressing those impacts, which we call loss and damage. In the climate change jargon, we have created 2 different terms. One we call adaptation, the other one we call loss and damage, but they're effectively the same thing on either side of the impacts happening. Before the impacts, we adapt. After the impacts, we address. And that's what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change decision last year in COP27 agreed to do. All countries agreed to set up a new fund to address loss and damage. And in fact, the Transitional Committee is meeting in the Dominican Republic right now as we speak for their third meeting. They have one more meeting before COP28 in Dubai, where we hope that this new loss and damage fund will be created. So let me close by just giving an illustration of this change in lens by which we look at things. And I use the topic of climate migration to explain it. In adaptation terms, we try to adapt where people are living. We try to help them to adapt where they are living. But at some point in time, adaptation is no longer possible. Once the land gets inundated by the sea, there's no more adaptation options left. People are then forced to move. Now, from an adaptation lens, we can think of that as secondary adaptation. Help them relocate somewhere else, maybe go to the nearest city or go somewhere else. That becomes a second order adaptation. The first order adaptation being adaptation in situ, where people are staying and living. And then second order being recognizing that they will not be able to continue there forever. There's a time limit on when they will be able to live there and have to move. Make them ready to move so that when they have to move, they are able to move. So we have two phases of adaptation. The first phase being helping people where they are. The second phase being helping them once they move. Now, if you turn that coin around and look at the other side of the coin, from a loss and damage perspective, the displacement that people are suffering from the impacts of climate change is a loss of livelihood. People are losing their livelihoods. And under the loss and damage framework of the UNFCCC, under the Warsaw International Mechanism, there is a task force that works on displacement of people due to climate change. And so displacement becomes a loss and damage activity as well. It can be adaptation, but it certainly is loss and damage. And so depending on what lens we look at migrants through, it is either loss and damage or adaptation. Adaptation has to be proactive for it to be considered adaptation. Loss and damage will be reactive once people lose their livelihoods. And the final comment I'll make is that in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the terms climate migrants and climate refugees do not exist. We have no definition for that. We have no agreement for that. What we call these people are people who are displaced because of the impacts of human-induced climate change. And increasingly, we are finding that the numbers of people that we can attribute to being displaced because of climate change are growing very, very fast, and we have to take that into account. So the post-8th APAN Forum has to take loss and damage as well as adaptation into account. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those words, Professor Salim. Incredibly important. Mr. Arona, I invite you to take the podium.
As we say in Cook Islands, kia orana, everyone. May I just offer my gratitude to the Secretariat of APN for inviting me here, really to bring the perspective of small island developing states from the Pacific Islands in looking and addressing loss and damage. Cook Islands, if you're not aware, is in the middle of somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Why I say that is because it's been flanked on the east by the Americas and then towards the west by Asia. Fittingly, how the professor has made the note that adaptation is not an option for some, and unfortunately, that is true for Pacific Islands. Cook Islands, with 240 square kilometers of landmass in an ocean of 2 million square kilometers, certainly paves the way that loss and damage is a concern. With the concern of sea level rise, the concern of acidification, the concern of high frequency of tropical cyclones and rainfall, as well as temperature in the next decade, in the next century, becomes a concern for our generation now and the ones to come. And we have tried our best in the conference of the party meetings to get the message across of how we can alleviate these losses and damages in small island states. As countries or small island states that contribute a great deal in terms of removing carbon with our huge ocean, we are so at admires of others that cannot come to make some compromise how we can make lives easier. It's a concern, but we just have to live with it. And I think the perspective from us is that we come here to share knowledge, and hopefully we can pick up one or two things from this kind of forum so that we can take it home and learn something from it. But I appreciate also the work that has gone in finding ways of bridging the gap to find some sustainable way of life in areas or in countries like ourselves to make sure that we prosper like you here in Asia. The climate conditions of Cook Islands are also similar with Pacific Islands, that now and then 4 or 5 years there's a high risk of storms, hurricanes, tropical cyclones. That's normally is driven by the El Nino ENSO, in which our large ocean is being utilized to monitor, let alone issue warnings for the globe. So it's a happy story in terms that we can protect we can make heed of these warnings, but it's a sad story on the long run that we'll be missing out on the sustainable growth and sustainability of lives and properties in our vulnerable islands in the Pacific. So we certainly agree that we have to share our information, our knowledge to find a way forward. Although I take more pride in contributing to IPCC, while our politicians take it across to the conference of the parties, the aim there is that the evidence has been shown by IPCC is certainly a sure concern that climate change is a reality, and that we just had to find a way to cope with these things, because we don't want loss and damage to dictate over what we believe in having a good future, both for this generation and the generation to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for those insights. Sobering indeed. A pleasure to have you here. Can I now invite our second set of two speakers, Dr. Deepshika Sharma, she's a climate and environment specialist at ICIMOD, and Mr. Karma Lodey-Rapton, regional technical specialist at UNDP. Welcome to the stage. Deepshika is a climate and environment specialist with expertise in water and environment, climate change and renewable energy. She leads the climate portfolio at ICIMOD and coordinates the action area on strengthening global leadership in sustainable mountain development. Deepshika plays a significant role in raising the profile of climate issues related to the Hindu Kush Himalaya for UNFCCC, and she is leading a special initiative to develop an investment framework for leveraging finance in the region. She is also the focal person for the UNFCCC UNEP LACI program for the Hindu Kush Himalaya. Her qualifications include a PhD in natural resource management, and she has experience working in national and international organizations in South Asia. Welcome. Karma Raptam is from the UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub, where he serves as the Regional Technical Specialist for the Climate Change Adaptation Team. He provides technical advisory support to country offices in the Asia-Pacific region, and he assists countries to develop capacity on adaptation planning and in accessing and implementing adaptation finance for resilient development in the areas of livelihoods, climate-resilient agriculture, water security, coastal zone management, ecosystem-based adaptation, and climate information and early warning systems. Karma has served in the UNDP Myanmar office for 5 years and in UNDP Bhutan for 7 years. Karma has also worked for the Royal Government of Bhutan for 15 years. Welcome, Karma. So I think that Deepshika has some slides. Welcome to the podium.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that very nice introduction. And it's my pleasure to be here at this forum, and especially at this, and talking about the Asia Pacific, the issues related to climate and loss and damage. Without any further delay, I'll start my presentation with the slides. So as we can see, the main issues related to, and I'll be mainly touching upon more on the physical aspects today, our multi-hazard environment, climate change and variability. There are many upstream and downstream linkages, connectivity and governance issues related to climate change. And this data is quite backdated, I would say. But if we do recent analysis, I'm sure we are going to get these number of disasters pictures vis-a-vis number of deaths and economic losses in a very different dimension. And we also need to find out these gaps and these data based on the analysis where we include the impact of climate change. If we see in the HKH, the climate context, I would say especially in the mountains, it will be more than the global mean and more rapidly at the higher elevation. And even in a 1.5 degree, we see that the warming will be higher in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. Now, this is just a pictorial view of the changes, if you see, of the glaciers from in the past almost 40 years, right? So 1982, then 1996, then 2008, and then it is a glacial lake, definitely leading to GLOF. We have a lot of climate extreme events in the region. We have GLOFs, we have flash floods, we have landslides. There is also drought, which are increasing. If you see these changes based on the construction, there is again a kind of chronological dimension to it, and see the change here. These are some of the pictures from the recent flooding. We all know about the floods in Pakistan, recently this year in Himachal in India, then in 2021, both in Nepal, India. And if we see only the figures of these, it goes in billions. And also the amount of I would say, the atrocities it has led to. And these are just some of them, not all of them. Now, as other distinguished speakers were mentioning, and also in the sessions in the past 3 years, past 3 days, I've seen that there's been a lot talked about in total. What are the recent, especially whether it is due to the precipitation or it is due to the flooding in these vulnerable countries. So what EC Mode is doing? We are doing at various levels. First, in the base of the transboundary risks, what we are trying to do is we are emphasizing a lot on studying the state of cryosphere. We are going to monitor in terms of increasing our capabilities and monitoring the snow and permafrost, the changes across the region. Then also what we are focusing is on the localization of early warning systems. My colleagues back in ECMOD who are experts in this will have more details about this. So we have working very closely with the governments, both at the national level as well as the, I would say, the district level, to implement these early warning systems and how we can improvise in that they work efficiently, both upstream and downstream. Another example I would like to give is that how we are enabling how we are enabling, having an enabling environment to enhance and robust the livelihoods. Especially, for example, now this is an example where what we are doing is helping farming communities by tunnel farming. This is one of the examples from Bhutan. We also have in Pakistan and others. Another thing which we are promoting in the irrigation sector is solar irrigation pumps. Third dimension where ECMOD is working is how we can strengthen the regional cooperation in the Hindu-Kush Himalaya, specifically on disaster reductions, by generating the evidences, by doing the actionable, assessing and analyzing the actionable data, policy and intervention analysis, conducting various dialogues at the national, regional, and science policy related, and also which will lead to kind of joint declarations. These are some of the networks our team has been working on. For example, we have a network of Upper Indus Basin Network. We have Koshi, DRR Knowledge Hub, and so on and so forth. Another dimension which ECMOD is doing, and which most of you are already aware of, is how to develop a formal mechanism for the cooperation in the HKH. So by closely working with the national governments of our member countries, and then developing a kind of formal mechanism. Hopefully it will be kind of developed in the upcoming ministerial summit in 2024. This is my last slide, and I think I just rushed it. Yeah, so what we did up till now in loss and damage, we worked very closely with our member countries, and based on the evidence provided by us, we tried to incorporate the various dimensions of loss and damage in the negotiations and the submissions through our member countries. We have been actively participating in the transitional committee of the Santiago network, and we are also developing a framework, comprehensive risk assessment as well, along with the framework for loss and damage, specifically for DRR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deepshika, it's great to see a regional organisation advocating for adaptation for several countries, and one that's working very well, and it's the kind of experience that we want to scale up to other areas of the world, so excellent. Karma, I invite you to the podium.
Very good morning to all the participants present here, and thank you very much, organizers, for inviting UNDP to speak at this plenary event. Before I start, I think it's useful to give an overall perspective of what UNDP does, and on the issue of loss and damage. I think the topic of loss and damage came into the UNFCCC negotiations for the first time in 2007, if I remember correctly. And I think since then, I think it sort of lost momentum, but later on, I think around 2013, 2014, then it picked up momentum again. And during the course of this period, I think a lot of things have happened, and also UNDP has also been supporting countries, especially in the area of climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and some of those work that we do on a day-to-day basis also contribute towards the disaster loss and damage. So, our work involves, we are present in almost all the countries around the globe. Our work involves holistic policy and programming support on a broad scope of issues related to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, which includes adaptation and resilience, disaster risk reduction and recovery, human mobility, health, access to finance, social cohesion in conflict and fragile context, governance, biodiversity loss, digital transformation, and so on. UNDP also works very closely with governments to strengthen institutional capacity and systems to mainstream climate change and disaster risk reduction principles into policy and planning processes, which also includes resilient recovery. On the right-hand side of the slide are just a few notable areas of UNDP's work related to loss and damage, especially as it relates to post-impact support. UNDP has so far helped develop national disaster loss and damage databases in 35 countries, through which we have been able to enhance data systems and capacity for evidence-based estimation to inform policy planning and loss and damage responses. This area of work contributes to furthering our work on digital transformation of the most vulnerable countries. UNDP has also been part of the post-disaster needs assessments of about 70 plus countries all over the world. These exercises are conducted to assess, among others, loss and damages following major disasters and extreme events. The PDNAs are based on globally accepted and flexible methodology that can be adapted to different events, including conflicts and pandemic. The scope of PDNAs are comprehensive, and the methodologies adopted address 18 sectoral and cross-sectoral needs. It also assesses human impacts and needs following a disaster and includes recommendations for institutional support for recovery. UNDP's work on DRR and climate change adaptation also involves capacity development of government and local stakeholders to plan, mobilize, and allocate recovery funding based on needs of the most affected population. The recovery funding is usually met through a mix of international as well as those aligned with the development budget of the government. Yeah, this is my last slide. I have only 2 slides. So, within the discourse on loss and damage, we see the following opportunities as UNDP for complementarity, coherence, cooperation, and coordination on loss and damage. Firstly, recovery is a space where the convergence of different program and financing frameworks can be planned and implemented at multiple scales and across multidimensional nature of risks. Recovery is an important window for investing in key areas to address loss and damage, and through building back better to avoid and minimize future shocks. There is also an opportunity to leverage and build on existing mechanisms for assessment and recovery by strengthening the data architecture of the post-disaster needs assessment and disaster recovery framework, and adapt it to address gaps such as for slow onset events and non-economic loss and damage. Loss and damage funding arrangements should be designed also to strengthen regional, national, and local financing mechanisms for recovery within the continuum of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Finally, there is also a growing concern that loss and damage funding will replace existing mechanism. UNDP supports the view that loss and damage funding should be additional, predictable, and adequate. It has to be grant-based to not increase the debt burden of developing countries. It has to be simple and easy to access. It has to be in the form of direct budgetary support to developing country governments and targeted financing for the directly affected communities and subnational governments. It has to be need-based and appropriate to differentiate national context and not a one-size-fits-all kind of fund. It has to also be integrated and consistent with the national sustainable development priorities of developing countries. And finally, it has to be aligned with planning and implementation timescales that range from short to long-term, decadal timescales to address the different timescales of climate events and development processes affecting developing countries on the ground. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for those 4 presentations, statements. So let me kick off with some questions, and if I may direct my first question to Salim. You provided a very useful framing of how adaptation differs from loss and damage. My question to you is, what kinds of capacity building support are needed to implement L&D responses that are perhaps different or distinct from adaptation responses? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica. So let me describe how things happen at the moment in terms of the distinctions. The world of adaptation is the world we live in. This is a climate change driven world, climate finance for adaptation coming, not enough, but we need more. We're investing in building capacity, in developing national adaptation plans, and so on and so forth. When impacts happen, when a flood happens, when a cyclone happens, then our job is done. There's no more adaptation left, right? That's when the humanitarian actors enter the scene. The likes of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, the likes of the World Food Programme. There is a UN OCHA system. UNFCCC is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but there's a UN humanitarian body where all the UN and non-UN organizations that work on humanitarian assistance, they come in. They come late, they don't have enough money, but they exist, they come. And the job then moves to them. That's what happens in the world today. That's the distinction that we have done institutionally. What I am saying is that's a false distinction now. We can't stop our job when the event happens, and they need to be involved before the event happens. And in fact, there are some interesting experiments going on, pilots where the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and other humanitarian actors are providing anticipatory funds, not coming in after the event, but providing funding before the event, which is much more effective. $1 spent before the event will prevent a lot of impacts, whereas it'll cost $10 after the event to come and help people when the event has already happened. And so what I'm arguing for is that this existing distinction that is there already needs to be merged. We need to be working with each other. The adaptation world, us, work with the humanitarian world. The humanitarian world needs to work with us. And we need to have a segue from adaptation to addressing loss and damage without us having to stop adaptation. So in my center in Bangladesh, we run courses on locally led adaptation. We've been doing this for many years. As of this year, we've changed the name of our course. It's not just locally led adaptation, it's also locally led adaptation and addressing loss and damage when loss and damage happens. So the adapters have to be ready to face the impacts of climate change when it happens, and then become active in addressing loss and damage. Okay, so it's actually a very fuzzy line. It's not a clear distinction. Some things are. A cyclone is very clear, but other things can be slow. Droughts are very slow. And so we need to be much better at understanding first, and then preparing ourselves to continue doing adaptation as much as we can, as fast as we can, as usefully as we can, but knowing that there are limits to adaptation. We will reach those limits, and we have to be ready for those, when we reach those limits, to segue into addressing loss and damage. So it's not as if our job ends when the impact happens and then somebody else comes in to help them. We can't afford that.
Indeed. Thank you very much for those insights. I want to turn to the second question. To Mr. Arona, you've worked for 33 years in the Met Services. You've probably seen a big improvement in early warning systems, both in your country but also in your region. I just wanted your perspectives on what technical and knowledge gaps take priority in the Cook Islands, in the Pacific region more widely, from your perspective. Where are we at now, and where are the main knowledge gaps?
Thank you, Jessica. The role that Pacific Island play heavily rely on our assets, which is traced back to traditional knowledge. A lot of the warning system has been based around those concepts. Unlike in Asia, where technology steps in to cater for an early warning system, we are still behind in terms of technology, mainly because of the lack of communication assets that's circulating within the region. The encouragement from us is that there are some plans being put in place by certain platforms, and this is through the work of the World Meteorological Organization in deriving themes like warnings for all, as well as the weather ready Pacific that has just been implemented a couple of weeks ago in Nandi, to find how we can actually incorporate these as part of our early warning system. But on the long run, in terms of our loss and damage, I feel that we still have a long way to go. That's why it's essential for us that we voice our concerns in any fora that we can attend, really to show concern, and hopefully the gap between stakeholders can be bridged so that we can go forward as one voice to support our concern.
Thank you, sir, for those insights. Let me turn to Deepshika. You work for ICIMOD. ICIMOD has been around for 40 years. You've done a lot in terms of regional integration. You've done a lot in terms of developing knowledge, data in the region. I just wanted also your perspectives on what the knowledge gaps are in the region, and what are the most effective ways of addressing those knowledge gaps? Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for the question. So I think one of the important is that, just to mention, especially since ICIMOD is working for the mountains, the first comprehensive assessment for HKH was done only in 2019, which was published. And just to show the, the difference in what we see is that even in today's scenarios, when we are in 2023, there is a huge and humongous gap in terms of the knowledge and the technical data as well. There is a gap in terms of assessing these glaciers, these melting of ice, which I've shown you over the years now. And if I see AR6, as I've been mentioning for quite some time now, it's almost, I think, after 20 years, the mountain chapter was published. So there is a huge disconnect between the upstream and downstream. It is very important to build these gaps in terms of not only knowledge or evidence or technical gaps, but also on the policies gaps. Also how we can, see from the other regions and other ecosystems that how we can probably learn a lot of lessons from, what is, I would say, which already exist in terms of the policy coherence and in other ecosystem, and how we can take it up to the mountains. So there is a huge gap, which with our first assessment, now what we are trying to do is going into the thematic assessments. So this year we did a specific assessment on cryosphere again, and now we are in the phase of having the science policy dialogue and forums around it to propagate it and to have policymakers and decision makers around the table to understand that how we can take it forward. So there is a gap in the field of monitoring of cryosphere, permafrost, then how it is affecting the downstream. Similarly, if I would say, on livelihoods aspect, how we can strengthen the value chain of the economies in the mountains, especially in the rural areas. And what Professor Huck was mentioning, it has not been studied, the gap. What is the adaptation amount which is required? What could be the loss and damage? And these are some of the very important data sets which is needed. So just some of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Karma, a question for you. You mentioned in your presentation about the opportunities for improved governance through the loss and damage agenda. I would like to turn that around and ask you, what governance structures at the national level would best support inclusive loss and damage? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that important question. The loss and damage database is based on the demands from the government. So obviously, it's of national importance, and then we support countries which request us for support. And there's an open AI platform called Disinventor, which provides the platform to establish national loss and damage database. So essentially, the basis is this platform, and then it's adapted to the needs of the national government. And we usually work very closely with the National Disaster Management Authority, which has the mandate to coordinate all the activities at the national level. So, there's now, in our region, a lot of governments have already established this, and this could essentially be used in advancing, the data and knowledge gaps that we foresee in this loss and damage discussion. For instance, in Cambodia, we have something called CAMD. CAMD means Cambodia Disaster Information. In Laos, we have LAO-D. It's called Lao Disaster Information. So, in the past, we've not been able to promote this database much. But I think with the growing discussions on loss and damage, at the COP level, and then when it trickles down to the national level, I think this will gain momentum. And as UNDP, we are happy to support countries to develop this database, which will provide evidence for, estimation of loss and damage, and which can then form the basis of this loss and damage fund that is being talked about. Thank you.
Fantastic. And maybe there's an opportunity to bring that information into national adaptation planning processes. I'll have to take a look.
Sorry?
Maybe there's an opportunity to bring the information into national adaptation planning processes.
Yes. No, I think, also through our climate promise work, we have also done some analysis on NDC implementation. And, this work has been going on for some time, right? Even before the loss and damage issues came up. And we see that, there's at least 35 NDCs in our region indicate loss and damage as a priority. So, there's a very growing demand at the national level, also from the governments in our region.
Thank you so much, Karma. So we've reached the time in the session where we will open up for questions from the audience. I'm not sure how clearly I can see who's putting their hands up, but there's two mics. Where?
Yes, I'm standing in one, and there is another one just to direct the participants.
Okay.
If anyone would like to
Babu,
ask the
I
question.
can't see too clearly from here, but maybe if you can identify who it is that wants to ask a question.
I'm standing here, so probably you are seeing me.
The lights are quite bright, so...
Okay, yes, light is probably bright. But maybe while others are thinking about the questions, first of all, I'd like to thank all the 4 speakers sharing their views and thoughts. But I have 2, maybe, the questions, and it'd be good if you can elaborate. And let me start what Salim, you have mentioned, is the close interlinkages between the adaptation and the loss and damage, an element of the continuum in these two. And also we have 2 group of actors who are working differently. So my question is how to bring them together so that as these 2 has the continuum, there is going to be no differentiation or the disruption that one community is doing adaptation and another community is doing the loss and damage because of the nature of the continuum. And the second one is Karma. Thank you very much for mentioning about the loss and damage, the database, which is very important. Now, what I understand in the context of the loss and damage data is the data of the existing, the disaster or the extreme events. What do a country need to do to understand the loss and damage in the context of the data and the information against the climate change that we are talking about under the 1.5 degree or the 2 degree or 3 degree? What a country needs to do to understand the future based on what they are already preparing in terms of the data available right now. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Babu. So I mentioned the separation of institutional groups and jurisdictions at the global level between UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention, and UN OCHA, which is the humanitarian response groupings. The same thing happens at the national level, as Karma just mentioned. So the UNFCCC is represented, or the governments are represented by ministries of environment, sometimes also now called environment and climate change. They go to the UNFCCC. But on the disaster side, the Ministry of Disaster Management are the ones that go and participate in the disaster risk reduction, the Sendai framework. There are parallel global systems that reflect themselves in parallel national systems as well. We can't afford this parallelism anymore, these silos. We have to work together at the national level, at the global level, and very much at the local level. Because at the local level, local people don't make these distinctions. For them, it's preparing for disaster and then dealing with the disaster. That's it. It's one continuum. They know what they're doing. They're trying to help. They're trying to prepare themselves. And so the challenge for us is to be better at working across these different silos that have existed already. We need to work together much more closely. At the UNFCCC, at the global level, let me just share with you something that I've been promoting. In fact, you may know that the UN Secretary General has just appointed a 12-member international scientific advisory board with 5 UN chief scientists and 7 outsiders, and he's invited me to be one of the members on climate change. And as it happens, we had our first meeting at midnight last night with the Secretary General for an hour and a half. And he spent 90 minutes with us, listened to each of us, and responded to each of us. And the point I made is exactly this. I said you have UNFCCC Transitional Committee setting up a loss and damage fund, hopefully COP28, and then you have UN OCHA responding to the events that are happening right now. There are events happening all over the world. And this cannot exist in parallel. You have to bring them together. And I advised him to set up a special envoy for loss and damage under the UN Secretary General, whose mandate would be to cover both UNFCCC and UN OCHA and connect to the national government systems and to local level as well, because this is disconnected and we need a mechanism to connect them. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question. If you can maybe come to the mic, please.
I think,
Thank you.
Jessica, there was a second question from Babu.
Okay, sorry about that. Please, come on.
I don't know if I understood the question correctly, but I think you wanted to ask about the linkage between disaster loss and damage database versus how you link it to the actual impacts of climate change, right? So I think the loss and damage database is just a tool, right? I mean, that's like where, first of all, we heard from the other panelists that there's a lack of data and information on loss and damage at the national level. I think this is a beginning. Once you have the disaster loss and damage database, that's where you start, right? That forms the basis. And, once you have a very strong database, then you can actually see the trends and predict future events based on what you have. So, in terms of long-term planning, budget allocation, and also in decision-making process, I think this tool could be very useful for national governments. And the methodologies that are employed in the disaster loss and damage databases are globally accepted, and as I mentioned earlier, it can be adapted to different context situations. So there's I think a lot of opportunity where we can sort of build this as evidence base for the loss and damage fund that is being now being operationalized, because it won't be like an open kind of fund where you can just ask and get it. It has to be like you have to apply for this and you have to have evidence to show that there was a damage or a loss. The same way as we have to do when we access funding from GCF, especially for climate change adaptation. They really emphasize on us, proposing a very strong climate rationale for the solutions that we are seeking to address through projects. So similarly, I guess, in order to also operationalize as well as access funding through the loss and damage fund, I think this tool will be very useful.
Thank you, Conrad. Apologies for overlooking the second question. There was a lady at the back there.
Good morning. My name is Susanna. I'm currently a graduate student at Sukmyong Women's University. I'm really happy that this is finally in the discussions. When it comes to loss and damage, in the Pacific, it's usually a very different issue, because loss and damage in the Pacific usually means that our islands are at risk of being lost underwater because of sea level rise. And adaptation helps to buffer that. My question is, when it comes to loss and damage, and when it comes to our islands disappearing, is there any works? I'm really glad that Professor Salim mentioned climate migration. In Fiji, there was an agreement before. We had some people from, some of the islanders from Kiribati moved to Rambi, which helped with the climate migration issue. And recently this year, Tuvalu has gone online to help address some of its disappearing islands. is there any treaty, international treaty available in Asia and the Pacific in the case where some of our islands completely disappear for migration, because some of our islands are island atolls and moving inwards is not an option? Are there international treaties or funding available to help properly relocate our islanders who are losing their islands? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Let me take an initial stab and then others can jump in. So there are two avenues in which this issue is being addressed. Thank you very much for the very good question. In the UN Framework Convention, it is something that will be addressed by the upcoming Loss and Damage Fund. We hope that it will take a very strong position on helping people who are going to be displaced by climate change. It's happening already, we know that. Nobody's helping them at the moment. We know that. We need to help them. We acknowledge that. So the challenge for the global community in COP28 this December in Dubai will be to come up with something to help them. I'm hopeful they will. On the other hand, there is another avenue that is also being pursued, which is one of climate justice, because these people who are being displaced did not cause the problem. And the problem is no longer a natural phenomena. It's a man-made phenomena. It's human-induced climate change. So some humans are causing the problem. And those humans are the ones who are polluting the atmosphere. So there is a natural justice element here to claim justice from the polluters to the victims of their pollution. And in the UN Framework Convention, the convention is a negotiating body. Everything has to be agreed by consensus. It's not an adversarial body. Everything has to be agreed. So this issue of seeking justice has moved venues now to the International Court of Justice, who have accepted a petition from the UN General Assembly to examine the human rights case that you mentioned. Do these victims of impacts of climate change have a rights-based approach to suing or asking for redress from the polluters who caused the problem? This is a legal question under international humanitarian law. The International Court of Justice has accepted the brief, the questions. They have asked for submissions from countries and organizations. The deadline for submissions is 25th January. Once they get all the submissions, they will then examine those and come up with a decision. The decision is an advisory decision. It's not suing anybody, but the advisory decision will be, can one country or one group sue another country or another group under international law, yes or no. If they say yes, then litigation can happen at the global level. If they say no, then litigation won't happen. So if you're interested in following that strand of discussion, follow what's happening at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It's not happening in the UNFCCC anymore. UNFCCC is, we have to agree everything by agreement. We cannot sue. This is not a place to sue the polluters. I hope that explains things.
Any more questions? Yes, sir. If you can go up to the mic.
Thanks everybody for a very stimulating conversation, and I'm at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I just wanted to check to get my bearings right. But for a long time you talk about adaptation and disaster risk reduction, very much combined. Now we're looking at loss and damage and disaster response mechanisms. We're looking for a new pot of money for that, but we already know we never got enough for the disaster responses in the first place. So how are we going to, and I was happy to hear your comments, Salim, there, but sorry you were up at midnight doing it, but happy to hear that you're looking at a kind of a system that could link the two together. But the fear is that with disaster response, people go in immediately to try and solve a problem, but there's never sustained funding for it. It's never a really comprehensive approach to building back better or building forward better. when you're looking at loss and damage, how are you going to sustain the income to make sure, or sustain the funds to make sure people can actually recoup the losses that they have made? And when we're talking about a system of applications for it, how are you going to make sure it's available to people living in the vulnerable communities? When you look at applications for funds, they're usually large, they're big, they go to corporates, they go to government. How are we going to get it down to the people who actually need it? And let's not create another system that makes it inaccessible and therefore kind of not really solving the problem. So just curious how we can make it work.
Okay, so 2 questions there. One is sustainable sources of financing, and the second question is getting it down to the people that need it. Who wants to take that question? Okay.
Thank you very much, Nal, for that. So let me frame the issue in a way that I look at it. All right? At the moment, climate change impacts are happening and people are suffering. So people are paying loss and damage out of their pockets with their lives, with their livelihoods, with their homes being destroyed. So people who are being impacted by climate change are paying already. It's not as if nobody's paying. They are paying. Right? Now, the question then for the rest of us is, how can we help them? Do we want to help them? Maybe, maybe not. And if we want to help them, how can we help them? All right? Now, if you look at the global system of who pays, for every disaster, roughly speaking, back of the envelope calculations, 80% to 90% of the payments are the victims. They are the ones who are actually paying, losing their money, losing their livelihoods. That's their payment. Maybe if a government is very good, the government comes in with maybe another 10% after the event to help them, relief, rehabilitation, disaster response. And the global community comes in a long time later with maybe 1%, 2%. That is the magnitude at the moment of the response. So 80 to 90% the victims are paying, 10 to 20% governments, depending on how good they are, come in and pay, and the global community is at 1 to 2%. So the challenge for us at the global community level is, how do we double, triple, quadruple the global community's response under different arenas? So humanitarian responses and loss and damage response. So in the loss and damage arena, in the UN Framework Convention where we work, we are trying to elicit a greater amount of responsibility and a greater amount of funding to support the victims of climate change. But always remembering, the victims are the ones who are actually paying. And this happens even in rich countries, by the way. The rich countries, when they get suffering wildfires in Canada now, thousands of people have been displaced. They've lost their homes in Canada. All right? The wildfires in Greece, 10,000 people have lost their homes in Greece, okay? In Europe. So this is happening all over the world. The victims are everywhere. Poor countries have more of them. Rich countries also have them as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's not forget that insurance is often touted as one of those financing mechanisms, but insurance requires risks to be predictably unpredictable. So once risks become too predictable, they become uninsurable, and that's something to bear in mind. It's often touted as a silver bullet, but it's really not, once we know that these changes are coming. Okay, we've got probably, we started 5 minutes late. I think we've probably got another 5 minutes, I would say. Time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
My name is Subel. I'm a journalist with Radio Free Asia. For Professor Hawk, what do you think will happen at COP28 regarding loss and damage fund? Do you think any positive outcome? How long do you think it'll take for the fund to actually be set up? And to Mr. Arona, Pacific Island countries, SIDS, have taken lead in things like this. For example, Paris Agreement. And Time and again, you have proven yourself to be a very, very effective bloc. Are you planning to do anything as such on COP28, given that Pacific Islands Forum is taking place in November in your country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on COP28, the incoming president of COP28, Dr. Al-Jabari, has set up a set of advisors for him as he enters the planning and execution of COP28. And he very kindly invited me to be one of his advisors. And when I accepted the position, I told him that I'm a one agenda advisor. I don't care what else happens in COP28. I want him to make sure that the loss and damage fund is set up in COP28. Because, you know, I'm one of the few people who's been to every single COP, all 27 COPs, and I know how they work, and they do not work fast. We have the transitional committee, they're doing their job, they're all very good people, they will do a good job, but they're going to come back and say we haven't finished. We need another year. So COP29, COP30, COP35. You know, when the Green Climate Fund was set up, the decision to set the Green Climate Fund was taken in one COP, and it took 5 COPs for it to happen. Right? That's the speed, the normal speed of the UNFCCC process. We cannot afford that laid-back approach. We need it to happen quickly. And I told him that the only way it's going to happen quickly is if you, as the incoming president, just say it's going to happen. You want to make it happen. You force the transitional committee to come up with something to start with. They don't have to solve all the problems, but they have to start something immediately, urgently. And I said, if you fail to do that, then I'm going to deem COP28 a failure. Right? If you fail to set up the loss and damage fund, I will declare that you failed. If you do everything else well, I don't care. The loss and damage fund in COP28, make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Probably about 10, 15 years ago, we have a couple of words that summarizes the way we do things in the Pacific, and we call it the Pacific way. Interestingly, it was also brought up this morning on the table before I came up of how we have taken on the approach in coming up with some consensus before we go to regional and international forum. Formulated about 5 years ago with the Samoa pathway, now it has become a distinct feature, a feature that's been recognized of coming up with some consensus in summaries and conclusion. And this is using the gesture of the talanoa. The talanoa is a traditional way of Pacific Islands sitting around a bowl of kava, just to enjoy the company, enjoy the social, and you find that a lot of issues will come out in surroundings like that. So we have taken that approach that when going to these international forums, that we formulate also these talanoas both nationally and regionally, especially with the assistance of our regional partners, stakeholders, to come up with some consolidated statement that we can take it across and pitch it then to these forums. We find that by utilizing that opportunity, as Chair mentioned, that we become a recognized bloc in conveying our message across. I'm sure that will answer your question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so we've reached the end of our session. Thank you all for your attention. I just want to finish with final reflections. 1 or 2 sentences. Start with Karma and work our way this way.
No, nothing much to say, but you know, I mean, UNDP is part of this technical committee, which is advising the transitional team under the the Santiago network on loss and damage, which Dr. Salim mentioned earlier. So we are engaged in this discussion of loss and damage through that technical committee. And if there are any demands from the national governments, from the countries, please get in touch with our country offices, and we'll be happy to take up your requests.
Thank you, Jessica, again. So just from EC Mode's perspective, I think I still feel that there is no limited discussions around upstream and downstream linkages. I think that is very, very important, and it needs to be strengthened. Secondly, going forward, since EC Mode is on the observer side, so we are following specifically what is happening in GGA and loss and damage. So to see where, since we just discussed the synergies and the differences between adaptation and loss and damage. So it is important to see how they are going forward together. So that is one of the, we are focusing on COP decisions. And I think lastly, in terms of investments, from EC Mode side, we are in the process of developing an investment framework for mountains and to upscale the investments and to actually initiate the projects on ground which are scalable and implementable, because we see that there is a very huge scope to work with GCF and adaptation funds in the region. So these are the three things. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I think from the point of view of Pacific Island developing states, we find this that it's a concern. The concern of sea level rise, and we have been deprived of that right to enjoy life to its full content. And we should be looking at opportunities how we can be compensated that. As we have heard during this forum, that there are opportunities, and we would like to work with you to hopefully enjoy those opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So I'm going to use this opportunity to respond to a question Babu put to me earlier, asking for what the message from this session would be for him to repeat at the closing session. And so my advice to you, Babu, is going forward, the APAN network needs to add loss and damage to the agenda, adaptation and loss and damage. And by the time we come back to the 9th forum, that should be a major stream in our activities, not just one isolated plenary session to talk about loss and damage. Thank you.
Okay. There is a problem with that, Salim, and that is, what acronym are we going to use? Okay, so I've taken down 4 points, Babu, that have come out to me as main messages. One is the framing of adaptation and loss and damage. Salim gave us ideas around, is it in situ? Is it displacement? And also linked to that, different communities, different institutional silos that are associated with the pre-anticipatory adaptation and the post-reactive loss and damage. Those two communities need to be brought together, those institutional silos need to be broken down, and those two areas of work need to start blending together. The second area is around the gaps. There are lots of them. Gaps on data, even though ICIMOD has been working in transboundary mountain work for 40 years, we heard that there are still big data gaps, big gaps in knowledge building. We heard from Karma, big gaps in the use of data that's been around for a while, but people, planners, governments are not using that data. Big gaps on awareness and on planning systems. Third message, big gap on financing, of course. There wasn't enough money for adaptation, there wasn't enough money for disaster risk reduction, and there isn't enough money for loss and damage. So how do we solve that? And the fourth message that came out loud and clear to me was that people are paying for loss and damage. It's just that the problem is that it's the victims that are paying. So the main question is, how do we support the people that are currently not only feeling the impacts but paying for them? So I hope that sort of summarizes the main discussions that we had. They were very rich. We have to bring the session to a close now, but thank you very much for your participation and your attention. Thank you.